Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. We thank you for joining us today. My name is Braden Knudsen. I'll be your host for this webinar. We'd like to ask you to answer a couple of our polls that we have down at the bottom of the screen as we go through a few of our announcements. Our next webinar will be tomorrow, Friday, March 24th at 4 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. And Kathryn will be returning again for us tomorrow, so that'll be good. So you can listen today and then come back tomorrow and get even more information. That'll be excellent. Also, we will be having another FamilySearch Family Tree question and answer session on Friday, April 7th. So we will be posting the April schedule here shortly. So look for a link to submit questions ahead of time for that one, and it'll be really good. The last one was really successful, and we hope you can come join us again for the next one. Also, as always, if you have any suggestions for future webinar topics, feel free to email us. The email is fhl_webinars@byu.edu, and we'll try to incorporate any topics that we can that are suggested. That'll be great. We're always looking for new ideas, so that'll be good. So today we'll be pleased to hear from Kathryn Grant, who will be giving a presentation titled Deep Dive, Tree Views in Family Tree. After years on the sidelines, Kathryn started her family history and discovered a new passion. Her specialty is mentoring new family historians and helping them find success, and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes she's made. Kathryn teaches family history classes at the BYU Family History Library and Riverton Family Search Library. She has also written a series for the Nauvoo Times on family history. She currently works for the LDS Church as a technical writer and business analyst. When she's not doing family history, she enjoys good books, uplifting music, and fresh raspberries. So we will turn the time over to Kathryn now, and as she's getting everything loaded up, I'll remind you we have a comments box in the upper right-hand corner and a questions box in the lower right-hand corner. If you have any questions, feel free to write those in, and we'll make sure they're all answered by the end. And we'll turn the time over to Kathryn.
Great. Thank you, Braden, and thanks everybody for joining us today. It's so good to be with you. So this webinar is called Deep Dive, Tree Views in Family Tree, and it is the second in a series of deep dive webinars that we're giving here at the BYU Family History Library. The first one covered FamilySearch.org, and if you missed that one, you can view that on the BYU Family History Library website, the webinar website. Then, as Braden mentioned, tomorrow we're going to do a deep dive into the person page. And so the three of those kind of form a set together, and hope those will be helpful to you. So this is, as you probably can tell from the title Deep Dive, this will be a comprehensive look at the tree views in Family Tree. So because of that, I wanted to just offer a little piece of advice at the beginning of this webinar, since it sounds very comprehensive. So because we'll be covering a lot of detail, I just wanted to mention that it's an important thing not to try to remember it all, because that will just add to the stress. You'll become familiar with the features by listening to this webinar, and also you can review the recording later. So my best advice for today, especially if you're new to Family Tree, would be just to sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. So first of all, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, what are tree views? They are views that show multiple generations, and FamilySearch Family Tree has 4 different types. There's the landscape view, portrait view, fan chart, and then also descendancy view. But even though those are different names, they are just different styles basically of a chart. They all show the same information, it's just in a different format. So the way you get to the tree view in Family Tree is to click the Family Tree menu at the top of pretty much any Family Search page. Or if you're a person who likes to use the address bar like I do, you can type in the URL shown here below, just familysearch.org/tree, and that will take you to the tree view. The menu here at the top of any tree view allows you to see any of the other tree views. And so you can tell from the little icons what the tree views are, except if you forget or they're not familiar, when you click the icon, as you can see over here, when I clicked the landscape icon, it actually gave me the name of the chart, and it does that for each of the other icons too. So that's kind of a nice convenience. So let's start out by looking at landscape view. The reason I chose to start out with that one is because it has the most features. It's the default view for most people unless you've changed the view. And then also it is the one I think that most people are familiar with. It's kind of the most traditional looking tree view. So for any tree, you're going to have a root person, and that's an important concept for all of us to be clear on. That's basically just the main person. It's the person that the view centers around. So in tree view on family tree, you've got your root person and your spouse here in the same box. The root person's ancestors are always shown to the right in landscape view, and then the root person's descendants are always shown to the left. 4 generations will be shown when you initially bring up your chart. So we've got the generation of the root person's children, and then of course the root person and his spouse, his or her spouse, and then the third generation would be the parents of the root person, and then finally the grandparents of the root person. Now, the reason really for limiting it to 4 generations on the tree view is that as you start to expand it out, it gets a little bit unwieldy, and it can even get too big to show in the screen. But there's times when you do want to show more ancestors, and it'll kind of slide some of them off the screen. So if you want to see more ancestors, look for these arrows at the end of your line and just click the arrow. And what that does is open up more ancestors on the right-hand side, or if you want to see more descendants, you click the arrow over on the left-hand side, and that opens up the descendants. What it does is open up 2 generations at a time, and then if you want to open up more people, then you look for the arrows at the end. And as you can see here, there actually aren't any more arrows, which means this really is the end of the line. There's nothing else to navigate to. So you notice that each couple here had an arrow on this chart. We looked at this one just a moment ago, but if we click this arrow, what it does is close the line that we were looking at here and open this line. And you can kind of see why it needed to do that, because there wouldn't be room to display both lines. And it's just an automatic thing. So if you click one arrow to open up, then it's going to close any other arrow that you have open. And as we mentioned before, if there's no arrow, that just means that that branch can't be expanded any further. Well, expanded may not be quite the right word. What it means is you can't open up any more branches because they don't exist. But of course, if you have the information, you can add to that line and expand it in that way. So an arrow by a spouse indicates that the person has more than one spouse. If you look up here at Philip and Harriet, there's no arrow next to Harriet, which means that this is the only wife in family tree for Philip. But for Thomas, he's got 2 wives in family tree, and we can tell that because of this arrow right here. If we click the arrow, we get a drop-down list showing all the spouses that are in Thomas for family tree. If you wanted to change the spouse, so for instance, here Elizabeth is showing, but if I wanted to show Jenny on the landscape view instead, I would just click her name, and then she would show up here in place of Elizabeth. If you see children here, you can click the down arrow to display the children. I actually usually prefer to look at the children on the person page because, as you can see here, it only shows 5 of the children without scrolling. And in order to see the rest of the children, you would need to drag the scroll bar down. If they only have, someplace between 1 and 5 children, then they'll all show up, and it can be a good way to just quickly look at the children in the family. But if you want the whole comprehensive view, then I recommend going to the person page, which actually leads us to our next item, and that is that if anytime you click on a person's name in landscape view, or actually any of the tree views, you get what's called the summary card. And the summary card is a handy little summary of key things about the person, such as their name, their PID or ID number, their birth and death, and then also the key places that you might want to go to on their person page. So if you want to move a person into the root position on the tree, for instance, I had Thomas as my root person, but if I wanted to make his dad Philip the root person, then I would click his name to open up the summary card, and then once I had the summary card open, I would click tree, and that would refresh the screen and it would show Thomas in the root position or excuse me, that's the second time I did that. It would show Philip in the root position instead of his son Thomas as it was when we started out. You can change the size of the tree to accommodate either your eyesight or your preference. You click the plus sign, kind of similar to mapping programs. Click the plus sign to make the tree larger, or click the minus sign to make the tree smaller. And also similar to mapping programs, you can drag the tree to a new position. That's especially helpful. As I mentioned before, sometimes when you expand lines, it scoots some people off the screen and it's difficult to see. And so you can hover your mouse pointer over any gray area of landscape view and then just drag it, and that will reposition the tree. Again, very similar to Google Maps or other mapping programs where you just click and drag to reposition what you're looking at. One of the most frequent questions that I get asked is, what are all those little icons all over the tree? Those icons are to help you with your research. Here's a quick summary. So the icon that is purple with kind of a road sign, I guess you'd call it, in it, offers research suggestions. The icon that has a little picture of a record offers record hints. And this is actually the same as record hints on the person page. So it shows records that FamilySearch has found in FamilySearch historical records that most likely pertain to this person. Now, it's not 100%, but in my experience, those records, I would say my own experience is probably around 97, 98% that those records do apply to the person. Very rarely do they not apply to the person, but still worth checking out. Check and see if they apply, and if they do, then you can attach them. If you see an icon that has a red box and a white exclamation point, that indicates a data problem. And data problems are things such as a mother having a child when she's 5. They're just physical impossibilities. Or, for instance, a child who has a birth year that is earlier than a parent's birth year. So FamilySearch alerts us to those things because they're kind of slam dunks, really. They're things that are so easy to fix because they're so obviously wrong. That, we know that the mom didn't have a baby at 5, and we know that the child was not born before the parents. So those data problems are actually wonderful hints, in a sense, that will help you easily correct problems on your family tree. And then finally, if you are a member of the LDS Church and you've signed in with your LDS account as opposed to a public account, then you may see green temples on a person's name as well. That indicates that ordinances may be needed. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, that was a nice little summary, but what if I'm on the tree and I don't remember what those are? Well, fortunately, FamilySearch lets you click the icon to see what it means. So it actually gives you the name of the icon, and then it gives you the information. So in this instance, the research suggestion is attach a source. The record hints, if you click that, it will open up and show you the record hints for that person. If you are not seeing the record hints, you want to click the Show button up here in the upper right-hand corner. Especially if you're using a public computer, somebody might have set the icons not to show. And so if you click this menu, and we'll actually take a more detailed look at this menu later, but if you click that Show menu, then you get a drop down and it allows you to decide which icons you want to see and which you don't want to see. And actually, that does not apply to green temples, if I remember correctly. In other words, you can't show and hide them from the Show menu, I believe. So I just wanted to mention a word of caution about green temples. There's a myth or a misconception going around that whenever a green temple shows up in Family Tree, that temple work is definitely needed. And that actually is not the case. One of the reasons for this misconception is that people have assumed, understandably, they've assumed that the church has put temple-ready names into Family Tree, and all we have to do is go in and find them. But that's actually not true. The church didn't populate Family Tree with temple-ready names. Actually, all the names in Family Tree ultimately come from users, just like you and me. And so whenever you find a green temple, you want to carefully validate the name. You want to resolve any obvious errors and also make sure the person is related to you. I remember a while ago I was looking on mother and daughter, and the daughter was hooked to the wrong mom. And those kind of errors, Family Search can't flag because they don't know your family. All they know is what somebody has told them. And so you want to go back and make sure that any person with a green temple really is related to you and that there's no relationship errors going from you to that person. And then finally, you do want to check for duplicates. So my friend Heather, who lives in Idaho, coined this saying. She said, think of green temples as an invitation to research. And I love that because they're an indication that someone might need temple work, but there's a few things that you want to check beforehand. So for more information about the data in Family Tree, here's a BYU webinar, a family history webinar that was given earlier that goes into quite a bit more detail about the data in Family Tree and why you don't want to just click on a green temple without checking it out. So now let's move on to portrait view. And the thing that makes me smile about portrait view is it's kind of a pun. So landscape, if you're familiar, if you've ever set your printer settings for different paper and you've looked at landscape and portrait, then you're familiar with the concepts of landscape and portrait. So in a landscape view, the wide view, the width-wise is going to be the longest, and then the height is going to be shorter. Whereas in portrait, the height is going to be longer and the width is going to be narrower. So you can see here, imagine back to the landscape view, it went from left to right all across the page, so it was wide. Whereas now looking at portrait, it's narrower and it goes from the top, or excuse me, from kind of the center really of the page to both top and bottom. So in portrait view, the root person is just a little bit below the center of the page. The children of the root person and spouse show below them, and the ancestors of the root person and spouse show above. Now, the reason I said it was a pun is that this view particularly lends itself to portraits as well. So not only is it portrait orientation, but it also is a very good view for seeing portraits of the person. So as you can see here, they've cut out some of the information, not cut out, they just don't display some of the information that you would have seen in landscape view to leave more room for the portrait. So in this case, I don't have any portraits on this part of my tree, but if you were looking in portrait view at a part of your tree that did have portraits, they would show up in these little placeholders. Here is something that could be potentially confusing. You remember that on landscape view, the arrow indicated that you could expand a branch. But here on portrait view, the arrow indicates that you can choose a different spouse. So don't get confused on that if you click it and wonder what's going on. It's just that the arrow has a different function on portrait view. So what are the things in portrait view that are the same as landscape view? These are two views that really have the most in common. So you can click a name to see any name to see the summary card. You can click plus or minus to resize the screen, or resize the tree, I should say. You can drag to reposition it, and you can show or hide the icons. Now let's talk about the fan chart. That is actually my favorite view, and I guess there's a couple reasons for it, that for it being my favorite. One is I just love the colors. I think they're beautiful. And the other reason is that it shows a lot of information in a compact space. So I can see if anybody's missing very easily, or I can see if I'm looking for a place to start, I can see if I feel maybe a heart tug toward a certain person. It's just easy to see that whole family in a compact space. So in the fan chart view, the root person is in the center, and the spouse of the root person and their children are displayed immediately below. So the spouse is here in this little semicircle, and then the children are all shown immediately below. If you want to see more children, if they have more than the 5 that can fit here, then you just click this gray arrow. And it's also the same for the spouse. In this case, Fanny and Joseph each did not have other spouses, but if Joseph had had another spouse, then you would have had an arrow here that would have allowed you to click and choose the other spouse. The the colors on the chart have meaning. So if you look down here to Joseph, his paternal line is going to be in shades of blue. If you look at his maternal line, it's all going to be in shades of green. Then if you go over to Joseph's wife, which is Fanny's mother, Rebecca, her paternal line is all going to be in shades of kind of orange-red, and her maternal line is going to be in shades of yellow. So this makes the colors make it really easy to distinguish which line you're looking at. Here's a trick on the fan chart that isn't available on any other chart. So we looked at how to put a person in the root position by clicking their summary card and then choosing tree, either on landscape or on portrait view. On fan chart you can also do that, but fan chart has this other cool little way of putting a person in the root position, and that is that you hover over the person and they become shaded, and also this little band shows up right here with a little icon of a fan chart in it. If you click the fan, then you put that person into the root position. So what about the fan chart is the same as landscape, since we're kind of using that as our baseline. You can click any name to view the summary card, and you can click spouses, or excuse me, show spouses and children. But the little difference here is that is only for the root person. You don't have any way of showing, like clicking a person to show their spouses and children unless you put them in the root position. The last view, the last type of tree view is descendancy view. So here we're looking at the default view for descendancy view. And I wanted to chat a little bit about how to navigate descendancy, since this tends to be one of the most puzzling views in my experience for people to use. So first of all, you can limit the number of generations that you see on descendancy view or expand them. So if you only want to see one generation, you click 1, or if you want to see 4, you can click 4. And then if you want to expand, you just click the expand button, and it lets you select which ancestor you want to expand on going backwards in time. So if you see a down arrow over here on the left-hand side, that means the branch is already expanded. So the spouse and children of that person are already showing. If you see a left arrow that not a down arrow, but a left arrow, it means the branch is collapsed. So these are basically toggle icons, and so in other words, if a branch is closed and you click it, it becomes open. If it's open and you click it, it becomes closed. So the root person in descendancy view is at the top of the page, which is a little, it's actually the opposite of all the other 3 charts, the other 3 views in Family Tree. So it's a little bit unusual. Like a lot of times people will think, well, isn't the root person more towards the bottom? And actually in descendancy, the root person is in the top position. And then the root person's spouse shows immediately below if they're in Family Tree. And you'll notice that they're slightly indented so that you can tell that they're a spouse of this person. Then the first child shows immediately below, but notice that this first child has no arrow icon next to her, and that's because she doesn't have any spouse or children in Family Tree. She died as a baby, so there's nothing to expand. But if you go down to the second child of the root person, then there's Anne, and she has a husband and children. And so her spouse shows immediately below, and he is slightly indented from her. So we've got the root person, his wife slightly indented, first child, then the second child with the spouse slightly indented, and then their children indented even more. So that's a kind of a crash course in how to read descendancy view. So what's the same about descendancy view as landscape view? You can click a name to view the summary card, and you can show or hide icons. But other than that, it's actually pretty different. So I wanted to talk a minute about the history list. If you have looked at somebody in Family Tree and then you've signed out and then you come back later, you may want to go to somebody that you've been working on. But Family Tree by default will go back to you in the root position. Well, it's really easy to get to another person. All you have to do is click this down arrow next to Tree on the menu and then choose one of the people. This drop-down menu will show you the last 50 people that you have looked at. So you can just choose someone by scrolling in that list, or you can actually filter the list by typing part of a name or part of a PID in this little field right up here. Now I mentioned that we were going to take more of a look at the show menu. So if you click the show menu, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see record hints, and you can either click the box to show them or unclick it so that they do not show up on your tree, on any of the trees. Same for research suggestions, same for data problems. Also for portraits, if there is a portrait that's been put in the person page, that's where you add the portrait, then they will show up here if you have selected this checkbox. And then finally, for space purposes, they allow you to decide whether you want the marriage information to show. So you can see that I've checked that I want marriage information to show. So if it's available, it shows for the person between the husband and wife. The reason for unchecking that would be to make this box smaller. Maybe you're trying to fit more on the screen. And so that'll take it out and it will shrink the box. So in conclusion, here's just a summary of the differences between the different views. And I'm not going to go take time to read through this. This is basically just for your information, and so kind of as a reference. So if you're watching this webinar later on, you can pause it here and just look at the different features that are available. The check means they're available. The X means that they are not available. So for instance, here you cannot drag the fan chart to a different position. So that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you so much for your time. And Braden, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we do have one question from Todd. She says, "Who should be the root person?"
Oh, that is a super question. It totally depends on what you need. And so basically, if you're trying to see the ancestors of a certain person, you would want to make them the root person. Um, in other words, if you're looking at your tree, you're not going to see many generations. Like we said, they're only going to show 4 generations with the option to show an additional 2. So if you, knowing those constraints, then you would choose your root person so that you would see the persons on Family Tree, their ancestors and their children that you are most interested in. Great question. Thank you very much.
Okay, I believe that is all the questions up to this point. If there are any more questions, feel free to write those in, and we'll make sure we get those answered. I'd like to thank Kathryn for the wonderful webinar. These webinars take a lot of work to put together, and so we're really grateful for everything that she does to present for us here. And if you didn't get a chance to answer our polls at the beginning of the webinar, feel free to take some time to do so now. We also have a feedback box if you would like to let us know how we're doing, what we can do to improve our webinars. Also, if you have any suggestions for topics, feel free to write those into the feedback box. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted onto our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel. And you can find the link on our website as well. And we'll have that posted within the next few days. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that you'll be able to join us tomorrow as well for our next webinar. Thank you.